when you said that the church in its original form was not concerned about buildings, was not too caught up with the institutionalized forms that we have grown so attached to today. And that's the truth, because the first 300 years of the church saw an entity that was so dominant, so strong, so clear, so fixated on purpose, so Christ-centered, so unified in their objective, so completely clear in their mission and mandate. Nothing was blurring, nothing was distorted. It was a church that was ferocious in every way. There was no barriers, there was no obstacles. Now, that was not a church that was completely void of obstacles and void of resistance. The church in the early days, it was overrun with opposition, overrun with persecution. It was constantly under attack, whether it be from the political entities, whether it be from other savage, barbaric entities. The church was constantly under a severe dimension of persecution. But it was interesting that despite all of the external resistance to this movement that started by Jesus, and that's a very important term that we have to hold to, because the church in the beginning was described as the way. So this was a movement. So despite all of the opposition to this ferocious juggernaut that we can call a movement, the church never slowed down, never stopped in its effort, was never deterred in its objective. It was never taken off course from its mandate, never drifted in any which way, despite the consistent barrage of external resistance to its efforts. You know when the church eventually slowed down? In 300 AD, in the days of Constantine. The moment institutionalized church became the norm, what external resistance failed to do, man seeking power and man seeking clerical terms and man seeking ecclesiastical office and man hiding behind bishopric and titles, that slowed it down. In other words, the greatest resistance of the church and its efforts to enforce the purpose of God in the earth, it has never been external resistance. It has always been an internal corruption. Something within the system that causes the average believer to suddenly want to gravitate to titles and power and pyramidic forms. That is far more corrupting than external resistance from barbaric entities. Put it this way, the biggest obstacle to the church is not an external devil, it is an internal ego. The biggest obstacle to the church arriving to its objective is not an external opposition, it's an internal motivation that is not consistent with the mandate allocated to God. So yes, the church in its original form was very clear. Buildings was not an issue. The moment ecclesiastical systems came into play in 300 AD, and there was this gravitation towards buildings and titles and offices, we began to drift away. And since then, we have not been able to capture the energy and the power that we had before 300 AD. Now, that is what led to all kinds of reformation. We could talk about the Zwingli, we could talk about the Calvin, we could talk about the John Husses of this world, we could talk about Count Nikolai von Zinzendorf, we could talk about Luther, we could talk about all of these major reformers, and each of those Reformation initiatives was nothing more than the effort of the Lord to pull the church back into an orbit of authenticity, to pull the church back into an orbit of accuracy. Are we anywhere close to that intent? Maybe we are, not necessarily being represented in what I call the smoke screen that presents itself as church today. Most of what people define as church is born out of the models that are very apparent in front of us. But I want to assure you that most of what we think is church is a smokescreen. The truth is what lives behind what is currently apparent. There is an almost underground, like a city within a city, like a Zion deep inside of the immediate structures, that is truly the essence of what the genuine ecclesia is supposed to be. It is almost like God saying to Elijah when Elijah said, I'm the only one left. In other words, Elijah in that regard almost represents the one that is most apparent. And God said, no, there are 7,000 others that you don't see, you don't know. They are not on your Christian televisions. They don't have the mega churches, but their hearts are pure, they are sincere. And so, yes, there is some effort of authenticity taking place, and there are true models existing in the midst of all the foolishness and the morass. There are true models, but they may not be the ones that you are seeing on Christian TV and the ones that are populating our magazines, etc. That's a different dynamic altogether. So that's the first point I want to identify. The other assurance I want to give to leaders is this: despite the prevailing sense of insanity that you see being evidenced within the church in its current form, the purpose of God has not missed a single beat. It is still very much on course, very much on time. When Jesus said, I will build my ecclesia, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, despite the pyramidic forms, despite the ecclesiastical forms, despite man's gravitation to titles and offices, etc., the purpose of God continues to move across the earth like a hot knife through butter. And so don't lose heart. Don't feel as though this thing is about to derail into a failed dawn. This thing is moving dynamically to one powerful conclusion, which is a church victorious and all the kingdoms of this world being assigned to the kingdom of his God and of his Christ. At the end of this whole process, God wins. And that's how this thing will go at the end of it all. To get back into some of the critical questions that you've asked in terms of church and kingdom, let me again pull this thing back into another